NATO sends more forces east after Russia is again accused of violating a member state's airspace. Ukraine is hit by some of the largest drone strikes of the war, while it attacks Russian energy facilities. So what's happened to diplomatic efforts to end this conflict? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Tom McRae. There's been no let-up in the war between Russia and Ukraine. Recent weeks have seen some of the most intense Russian drone strikes yet, while Ukraine has repeatedly targeted oil refineries. A month ago, all eyes were on the diplomatic drive led by US President Donald Trump. Now, all eyes are on the skies in Ukraine and elsewhere in Europe, with Estonia, the latest NATO member to accuse Russia of entering its airspace. Trump has threatened but not imposed new sanctions against Russia for not taking significant steps towards peace. And opinion polls in Ukraine suggest support for continuing the war is weakening. So what are the options for Ukraine, its European allies, as well as for Russia? And what are Trump's intentions? We'll discuss all of this with our guests shortly. But first, this report from Imogen Kimber.
Russia is accused of violating the airspace of a third NATO member state in just 2 weeks. Estonia says Russian fighter jets remained in its skies for 12 minutes, despite being asked to leave by NATO's Baltic air policing mission. The foreign minister says Russia is testing boundaries.
Just a couple of days before, we saw a full-scale attack against Poland with 19 drones. And if you put it all in the pattern, so Russia is turning on the heat, Russia is testing more NATO.
The drones over Poland were shot down. Days later, Romania scrambled its fighter jets and urged citizens to take cover until the Russian drone had left. However, Moscow denies entering Estonian airspace, saying its planes were flying in neutral territory. Estonia says it's an attempt to redirect Western nations' resources away from Ukraine. NATO has been bolstering air and ground defences in the east, with equipment from France, Denmark, Germany and the UK.
We've sent a Typhoon and a Voyager to support NATO missions in the eastern flank. And of course, we are in close contact with both Poland and Estonia. This is a very serious breach. It's potentially a serious escalation.
Attacks by Ukraine and Russia on each other's territory have been increasing, with Russia launching some of its most intense drone strikes since the war began. This attack caused a major fire in Zaporizhia. For its part, Ukraine has been targeting Russian energy infrastructure, including its oil refineries. The intensity of these assaults follows last month's intense diplomacy. US President Donald Trump met the Russian president in Alaska before hosting the Ukrainian president and European leaders at the White House. Trump's plan then was for direct negotiations between Vladimir Putin and Vladimir Zelenskyy, with threats of further sanctions if they didn't happen. But so far, there have been no talks, no additional sanctions, and instead, more war. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Okay, let's bring in our guest now. Joining us is Peter Zalmayev, who is the Executive Director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative and joins us from Kyiv. Chris Weafer is the CEO of Macro-Advisory, a strategic consultancy focused on Russia and Eurasia. He is in Moscow. And in Berlin is Stephen Erlanger, the Chief Diplomatic Correspondent in Europe for the New York Times. Thanks so much for joining us. We really do appreciate your time here today on Inside Story. Chris, if I could begin with you, as we heard in the story there, Russia is turning up the heat right now. Why is it, and what is the effect that it is having on the EU and NATO?
Well, I think, look, there's a couple of reasons, I guess, that we can make a reasonable assumption on. One is, as you mentioned in the report, Kyiv has ratcheted up attacks on refineries and some energy infrastructure and has been doing damage. There's no acknowledgement of what the specific damage is in terms of output, etc., because all of that is deemed a state secret. But it is quite clear that those attacks have become a lot more effective. So on the one hand, Russia is retaliating in whatever way it can, which is increasing pressure on the population and hoping then that forces the Kiev authorities to reduce attacks in the refineries. That's one reason. The second reason is, as again you mentioned, the opinion polls, which are widely reported here in Moscow, and people therefore are aware that the growing number of people in Ukraine that would prefer peace rather than continued war. And I guess the attacks on Kiev, therefore, are possibly a crude way of increasing that pressure and hoping that public opinion, kind of increases more. The one point I would say, though, is obviously there is a great deal of speculation over what exactly was discussed between Presidents Putin and Trump in Alaska. It is assumed, and there have been statements from people like U.S. Secretary of State Rubio and others to confirm that while there has been no kind of high-level contact since the Alaska summit, that there remains a fairly active lower-level engagement between U.S. and Russia. And then my final point is that Moscow has always said that it is only interested in negotiating a peace settlement with the United States and not directly with Kiev and not with the European Union, the assumption being that Washington will be able to kind of push the agreement to those sides later. So I think that's why we're not seeing anything publicly happening between Russia, Ukraine, Russia, European Union. Clearly the situation is deteriorating, but there is enough evidence to show there is a continuing dialogue with the US. And there's for sure, there appears to be some kind of unpublished agreement between both sides that they're working on.
OK, we'll have to talk about that in just a moment. But first, Stephen, if I can come to you next about these latest Russian incursions into NATO airspace. What do you make of the response from the EU and NATO? I mean, obviously, much is talked about the West really needing to stand up and push back against this increased Russian aggression. Do you think that it has been strong and unified enough?
It's been pretty strong and unified. I don't think the EU is really a major factor in this. This is about NATO and NATO territory. And the EU doesn't have an army, as we all know, but 23 of the 27 EU members are members of NATO. I do think NATO is taking it very seriously. It does show up vulnerabilities along the eastern flank, especially for new drone warfare. There is a kind of lack of modernization, if you will, a la Ukraine, inside NATO. And to use very expensive weapons to shoot down drones seems quite absurd. However, there's no question that Poland believes that the 21 drones that went over Polish territory were intentional because they were all fired from the same place in Russia, which was different from the site used to fire drones over Ukraine. So there was a testing going on. Over Estonia and the Baltics, there's always been incursions of short periods by Russian planes with their transponders off. This was a particularly long one, and I think, again, tested NATO's response. And I think NATO, though it said it responded immediately, I think felt it was a bit slow to respond. And the only division is you have some people in NATO saying next time Russia does that, we should shoot them down.
Peter, from a Ukrainian point of view, is this the wake-up call that NATO might have needed to the dangers of not doing more? Because this is happening right on their doorstep.
Well, every step of the way. We've seen these provocations before over the last 2 and even 3 years, and now 3 in a row over Poland's territory, and then Romania, and then finally Estonia. Ukrainians are not happy with the sort of response NATO has put on. Maybe it's not fully justified, this sort of attitude. But Ukrainians do believe that this merited the invocation of Collective Security Agreement, Chapter 5 of NATO's charter. Be that as it may, I mean, you can quibble about what NATO should have done. Did that amount to that attack that justifies the invocation of this article? But most Ukrainians believe that Putin will continue with these. He has been encouraged to continue with these. An attack on NATO will not come in a too obvious of a fashion. There won't be tanks rolling over the territory of NATO, whether in the Baltic states or Poland, but I'll be proceeding exactly along the lines that we've been actually observing even before these particular provocations. As you know, Russia has been engaged in a campaign of sabotage, arson, and assassination attacks all across Europe. One can argue that Russia is already engaged in a full-scale, albeit hybrid way of aggression against NATO. And so the question is when and if NATO will invoke that Chapter 5. Putin is obviously doing this to water down this crucial, foundational component of NATO. Without Chapter 5, NATO will be nil. The effectiveness of NATO, the security guarantee will be nil. And Putin is exactly in the business of right now of showing to NATO members, individual NATO members, that the charter of NATO, the security guarantee, is simply not worth the paper it's written on.
Chris, I'd like to get you to respond to that. Is that the sense there that you get in Moscow, that that is the intention behind these attacks from Russia?
Okay, well, we should say very clearly that these are the sort of discussions that you cannot have in Moscow. As you probably recall, it was made specifically illegal and a criminal offense to discuss any matters related to military activity involving Russian forces. So nobody's going to have these discussions sort of out loud in Russia. But, you know, that's what Peter has said certainly makes sense. I don't think anybody would disagree in terms of the testing, etc. And it may very well be to do with this question of security guarantees, because we do know, as I said earlier, there are ongoing discussions between the US and Russia at a lower level about what could be in a final peace agreement. It would then have to be put to Kiev, of course. But we keep hearing that, you know, one of the key topics is this question of security guarantees, as well as, of course, boots on the ground involving NATO soldiers or not, and what happens to the currently occupied territories. But security guarantees is clearly one of those issues. So it might not be an unreasonable assumption to make that, you know, the robustness of security guarantees may very well be tested at this time during the negotiations. But we can say for sure that the question of what sort of security guarantees that NATO, that the West will give to Ukraine, that Russia will accept or will least object to, perhaps, that is one of the key topics right now. And perhaps these incursions are no coincidence against that backdrop.
Stephen, as we were talking about before, the number of drone attacks from Russia into Ukraine has really increased in the last month. I believe that Russia is trying to get to a point where it can launch 1,000 drones in a single attack, which would likely overwhelm any air defences. What effect would that have on a civilian population that is clearly fatigued after years of war?
You mean on Ukraine?
Yes, on Ukrainians.
Well, Ukraine's not ready to give up this war. It's not going to surrender to Putin. It has no reason to. I mean, it has been undergoing quite a lot of bombardment for a long time now. Yes, there's a morale issue. They have manpower issues, but their defenses are holding pretty well. The Russians have pressures on them too. And I don't see Ukraine collapsing for quite some time. I don't see a ceasefire coming. I don't see a peace settlement coming. And I must say, this drone business this is not Article 5. This is, this just makes a little bit of hysteria among Western media. It's not a full-scale war. There isn't even a full-scale hybrid war. There is a hybrid war going on. It's true Putin would like to divide NATO. It's true Putin always intended, as he keeps saying, to deal with the root causes of the conflict. But at the moment, Russia's not strong enough to pursue that. And I think we're in for a much longer stalemate. I do think Russia has to be careful. Don't forget, in 2015, Turkey shot down a Russian fighter jet over Turkey that had been over Turkey for about 12 seconds as it was operating near Syria. So this is not the first time that this has come into play. And I think there's a game going on. The game's been going on for some time, but I must say, I think NATO's learning some lessons, and NATO has increased its deterrent. And I think people should take a breath.
There might not be any willingness within Ukraine to completely fold to Russia, but the appetite for the war continuing is also waning. There's a Gallup poll that was out in July that showed that only 69% say they favour a negotiated end to the war as soon as possible, compared to just 24% who supported continuing to fight until victory. And that is a complete reversal of what we saw at the beginning of the war, isn't it?
Yeah, but if you ask the same people, would they like to give up half of the Donbass, the rest of the Donbass, to Russia for free? I suspect you'll find people will say no. Of course, people are tired of the war. Of course, they want a negotiated solution, but they want a fair one. They want a decent one. They don't want a capitulation to Russia, because they know, looking at Bucha, looking at Mariupol, they know exactly what that would mean.
Peter, you're in Kiev. What's the sense that you get there? I mean, are people willing to see this continue for potentially even a year or two more?
Well, I think Stephen has it exactly right. You have to really define victory, define coming to terms with Russia, coming to some sort of an agreement. This would not be, of course, coming to an agreement on these so-called root causes that Vladimir Putin keeps talking about, which amount to Ukraine's capitulation. No one is talking about this. Yes, there is fatigue with the war. There are problems with recruiting manpower, recruiting troops, soldiers into this war, and this is something that has to be addressed. The math, of course, is decided not in Ukraine's favor when it comes to simple manpower. That has to be decided down the road, and sooner rather than later by Ukraine's allies. Look at Russia's allies. It's North Korea has been willing to send soldiers. Ukraine's Western allies have not, and that is a problem, of course. Having said that, also please keep in mind that I think Ukrainians while they're seeing all these problems, the main one is that of a moral sort of discouragement that the Western leader, the leader of the Western world, Washington, the new government, the new administration, has essentially abdicated its role as a promoter of a liberal democracy and has essentially been willing to walk away from its allies. This has done tremendous damage to the morale, not just of the fighting men and women in the battlefield, but to, of course, civilians. And that has also been borne out by the findings of the Gallup poll that you're referring to. Only 20% of Ukrainians consider that America is pulling its weight and is doing right by its allies, including Ukraine. And in the absence of this support, we're nearing the Georgian scenario, I'm afraid, the neighboring country of Georgia, post-Soviet state, where there's in the power, the party in power, Georgian Dream, has essentially been a tool of Russian influence in the country. They jailed the former president Saakashvili, and so Russia, just stopping short of occupying this country in 2008, actually clawed back what it considers its own. It wanted to have its influence in Tbilisi. It got it through this soft sort of means. And that is exactly the other scenario that Vladimir Putin is considering, just stopping short of an outright military victory, which is not in the cards in the near future. Vladimir Putin wants a change of power in Kiev.
I want to talk a little bit about what's happened since Donald Trump met Vladimir Putin in Alaska. You've alluded to this a couple of times so far in this discussion about ongoing talks between Russia and US. Can you just elaborate on that?
Yes, I mean, it is confirmed by a number of senior official statements. As I mentioned, Marco Rubio, who said that you cannot, if I get this quote right, he said, you cannot continue or conclude any meaningful discussions in the public sphere that they have to be done behind closed doors and then brought to the public sphere. Now, I hope I'm paraphrasing him correctly, but he confirmed that talks are continuing. We are aware from talking to other people in Washington as well as in Moscow is the dialogue at different levels is continuing. So it's not a case that just both leaders walked away from Alaska, haven't talked on the telephone since, or there hasn't been any formal meeting in Istanbul or whatever. That does not mean that this process has not continued. The evidence is that it is continuing and that they're having discussions about what both sides, and again, I do stress both sides, Washington and Moscow only, would like to see in a peace deal. Of course, the US does continue to say that while they are looking to formulate a peace deal, they will not enforce that on Kyiv. They will present it to Kyiv and I guess to the European partners as a deal that can be done, and then that would start the next phase. But I would like to actually just make one clear point. When we talk, Stephen, Peter talk about the sustainability of Ukraine, that does assume the continued support of the United States at least the current level, whether that's particularly in terms of the battlefield, like Patriot missiles, supply battlefield intelligence, all of which we know comes from the US, and really is either in short supply or is not available from European NATO allies. So your US position is quite critical. Donald Trump does have the ability to bring an end to this war. I won't say tomorrow, but he does have the ability to bring an end to it. He could, for example, carry through his threat of significantly ratcheting up sanctions against Russian oil exports. That would cause a severe budget problem in Russia and would put the economy under severe pressure, which would change the game. Equally, he could threaten to withdraw the military support for Ukraine, which he does allude to from time to time, which would leave Ukraine in a very difficult military position. So the US remains critical. And even though the Europeans are clearly very frustrated not to be part of this, the evidence is that the discussions with Washington and Moscow are continuing. And at some point over the next couple of months, I definitely would expect an announcement of what they see as a peace agreement to be announced, and that then to be presented to Kyiv and Europe for further discussion. That's, I think, the way this goes.
OK, Stephen, while the dialogue might be continuing, the attacks certainly escalated in the last month or so. What's the US strategy at this point? What do you see Donald Trump potentially doing here?
I think he really does want Europe to take responsibility. He has generously offered to sell weapons that are made in America for Europeans to buy to give to Ukraine. So far, there is no indication that he's going to stop the battlefield operational in intelligence that is so important. I mean, you're quite right. I mean, it's crucial because it tells the Ukrainians what missiles are flying toward them and where they're likely to land and how they might be intercepted and where Russian troops are. And there are advantages that Europeans don't quite have the same ability. But so far, Trump hasn't stopped that. I don't think he will because he's very frustrated with Putin. I don't think he's going to impose any real sanctions on Putin either. And I do agree there are talks going on. The talks also include, very importantly, bilateral issues like arms control and mutual recognition and spare parts for Russian planes. And even, I gather, the Russians are presenting offers about energy cooperation and restarting Nord Stream 2 and rare earth options, trying to appeal to Trump, the businessman. So things are in play. There is no question. But I don't think you're going to easily impose an unfair settlement on Ukraine that involves giving up permanent territory. And maybe like Cyprus, you agree to have a ceasefire, fair enough. But I think Zelenskyy politically cannot survive the kind of deal that Witkoff came home from Moscow presenting.
Okay, Peter, if we can get your thoughts on all of this. Obviously, there are a lot of options and scenarios ahead for Ukraine and Zelenskyy, like we heard there. What do you think are the most realistic in the next 6 to 12 months?
Well, I think the most realistic was a continuation of the hostilities that we're seeing. And we can, of course, talk about the peace agreement all we want, but I think Vladimir Putin has set his mind on Ukraine's complete capitulation. And so we cannot really expect any winding down on that front. So Zelenskyy has actually deftly been able to, engage with Donald Trump as much as he could. And with the European allies, we need to have the Europeans on board, of course. I mean, that's our sort of last resort here, and I think we're moving in the right direction, talking about a joint production of drones, etc., something that allows Ukrainians to wage asymmetrical warfare with Russia. That's the only way we can, if not win, then continue to resist successfully, going after Russian oil refineries and making it too costly for Vladimir Putin to consider continuing this war indefinitely.
Okay, Chris, finally, if this war drags on, which, as we've been hearing, is one of the more likely scenarios, who's better placed to actually handle that and withstand this? Is it Russia or Ukraine if it continues to get the Western support that it's got right now?
Well, look, the obvious answer is that nobody wins from a war of any sort, and especially a long war. But to answer your question, on a relative basis, I guess if Ukraine continues to get Western support, and particularly US support, then yes, it suffers a great deal of damage while the fighting continues, but it'll be much better placed afterwards for recovery. Whereas it'll be the opposite for Russia. The longer the war continues, the more kind of damage is being done to the economic infrastructure, the more money is being diverted from developing the economy into sustaining the military, etc. And therefore, at the end of it, Russia will have a much, much longer and a much more difficult recovery process. So, frankly, I'd say it clearly doesn't suit either side. But the longer it goes on, the more long-term damage it does to Russia's ability to recover.
Peter, Chris and Stephen, thank you so much. We have to leave it there. We've run out of time, but we really do appreciate your insight today here on Inside Story. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Tom McRae, and the whole team here, goodbye for now.